Imagine a wind that never stops. It moves across an ocean of grass so wide that a man could ride for a month and see nothing but the same low hills folding into the same pale sky. There are no walls here, no cities of stone, no roads worn smooth by centuries of feet. There is only the grass, silver green in summer and iron hard in winter, and the enormous emptiness above it, and the sound of the wind moving through everything like a breath that has been drawn for 1,000 years and never let go. Onto this endless grassland, 800 years ago, a child was born into a small and quarrelling people who owned almost nothing. He had no city, no throne, no written language, no gold. His father was poisoned when he was still a boy. His family was cast out to starve, and yet, within a single lifetime, this outcast child would forge from the scattered tribes of the steppe the largest land empire the world has ever known, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the gates of Europe. An empire so vast that a message could travel across it for months and never leave the reach of a single law. His people called him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. To some, he was a bringer of order, a lawgiver who made it possible for a young woman to walk alone across a continent carrying gold and fear no one. To others, he was the end of the world, a storm of horsemen who left cities emptied and rivers dark with ash. Both of these things were true at once, and that is part of why the story has never let go of us. Tonight, let the wind carry you. Settle into the dark. Let your breathing slow, and let the grass roll out before you toward a horizon with no edge. This is the entire story of the Mongol Empire. From a hungry boy hiding in the reeds of a cold river to the golden courts of China, from the first quiet gathering of frightened tribes to the slow fading of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Before we follow the boy, we must first understand the world that made him, the vast and difficult land that shaped a people unlike any other. So let us begin there, out on the open steppe, where the story truly starts. The land the Mongols called home was one of the harshest places on earth in which men had ever chosen to live. It lay in the heart of Asia, a high plateau of grassland and desert and cold blue mountains, ringed by forests to the north and by burning sands to the south. In summer the sun beat down without mercy, and the grass grew tall and sweet, feeding great herds of horses and sheep and goats and long-haired cattle. But the summers were short. For much of the year the wind came down from the north like a knife, and the temperature fell so far below freezing that a man caught in the open without shelter could die in a single night. Snow lay upon the ground for months. The rivers turned to ribbons of ice, and the herds poured through the frozen crust to find whatever brittle grass remained beneath. To survive in such a place, the people of the steppe had learned to carry their whole world with them. They did not build cities, for a city cannot follow the grass, and grass was life. Instead, they lived in round tents of felt stretched over a lattice of wood. Tents they called gurs, warm and snug against the wind, that could be taken down in an hour, loaded onto carts, and set up again 100 miles away beside better pasture. They moved with the seasons, following ancient paths their grandfathers had followed, up to the cool high meadows in summer, and down to the sheltered valleys in winter, always searching for the next stretch of green. Their wealth was not counted in coins or land, but in animals. A rich man was a man with many horses, and the Mongols loved their horses above all things. These were not the tall, graceful animals of the settled kingdoms, but small, shaggy, tough little beasts with great endurance, able to survive the winter by digging for grass under the snow, able to carry a rider for days without tiring. A Mongol child learned to ride almost before he could walk. It was said that a Mongol was born in the saddle, and would die in it, and there was truth in the saying. On horseback they herded their flocks, they hunted, they made war, and they crossed the immense distances of their homeland as easily as a fish crosses water. They lived on what their herds gave them. They drank the milk of their mares, which they let ferment into a mildly sour drink that warmed the blood on a cold night. They ate mutton and the flesh of the hunt. They wore wool and leather and furs. Nothing was wasted, for on the steppe waste was death. A people so lean and hard and mobile owed nothing to the great settled civilizations that lay beyond their borders, the rich farming empires of China to the south, and the trading cities of Central Asia to the west. Those places seemed to the nomads like another world entirely, a world of walls and gates, and soft, well-fed men who had forgotten what it was to be hungry. But the steppe did not make one people. It made many, and they were bitterly divided. Across the grasslands roamed dozens of tribes and clans, the Mongols and the Tartars, the Karats and the Naimans, the Merkits and the Uyghurs, and many more, each with its own chief, its own grazing lands, its own long memory of insult and revenge. They fought each other constantly, raiding for horses, for women, for pasture, for the sheer pride of it. A man might spend his entire life at war with the tribe in the next valley without ever once seeing the great cities beyond the horizon. Blood feuds passed down through generations. A killing demanded a killing. A stolen bride demanded a war. The steppe was a place of astonishing beauty and astonishing violence, and no one had ever united it, for it seemed by its very nature ungovernable, too wide, too wild, too proud. Into this fractured world, in a year we now reckon as somewhere close to 1162. In a small camp beside a cold river in the northern grasslands, a woman of the Mongols gave birth to a son. The old stories say, the infant came into the world, clutching in his tiny fist a clot of blood, dark and hard as a stone, a sign the elders read as an omen of a life that would be soaked in war. His father named him Temujin. No one who saw that small, red-faced child squalling in the arms of a nomad woman in a tent of felt could have dreamed what he would become. He was one boy among thousands, born into poverty on the edge of the known world, and yet the wind that never stops was already blowing toward him. Temujin, whose name is sometimes said to mean iron or blacksmith, spent his earliest years as the son of a minor chief. His father, Yesugei, led a small band of Mongol families, brave enough and respected enough, but far from powerful, when Temujin was still very young, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. His father took him riding across the steppe to find him a bride, as was the custom. They came at last to the camp of another tribe, where Yesugei arranged for his son to be betrothed to a girl named Bote, a little older than Temujin, quiet and clever-eyed. In keeping with tradition, the boy was left behind with the girl's family to grow into a man among them, while his father turned for home alone. On the long ride back, Yesugei stopped at the camp of a band of Tartars, an enemy people, and asked for food and drink, as the harsh law of steppe hospitality demanded. The Tartars recognized him. They remembered old wrongs, old killings, and they saw their chance. Into his bowl they mixed a slow poison. Yesugei rode on, not knowing what had been done to him, and by the time he reached his own camp, he was dying. In his last hours, he called for his eldest son to be brought home. A rider was sent racing across the grass to fetch the boy, but by the time Temujin returned, his father was dead. With Yesugei gone, everything collapsed. The families who had followed him owed their loyalty to a strong chief, not to a widow and her small children. Almost at once, they abandoned the household. They struck their tents, gathered their herds, and rode away, leaving Temujin's mother, a proud woman named Hoilun, alone on the steppe with her young children, and almost nothing to keep them alive. It was, by the cruel arithmetic of that world, a death sentence. A family without a herd, without warriors, without allies, was not expected to survive the winter. But Hoilun did not lie down and die. The old chronicle remembers her tying up her skirts and, taking up a walking stick, going out along the riverbanks to dig for wild roots and bulbs, gathering the fruit of the wild trees, catching small fish and marmots, and whatever the land would yield, a host of golden fadils. She fed her children on the poorest scraps the steppe could give, and she filled them with something harder than food. She filled them with the will to endure, and with a burning memory of those who had left them to die. Those years of hunger burned themselves into Temujin. He learned, young and forever, that loyalty was the most precious thing in the world, and that the lack of it could destroy a family in an afternoon. The hardship did not make the household gentle. It made it fierce and sometimes cruel. Temujin had a half-brother named Begta, a little older, and the two boys quarrelled bitterly over the scraps of their survival, over a fish, over a lark that one had shot and the other tried to claim. To Temujin, Begta was a rival for the leadership of the family, and a bully who took food from his mother's mouth. One day Temujin and his younger full brother Kasar crept up on Begta as he sat watching the horses on a hillside, and there, in cold silence, they killed him with their arrows. When their mother learned what they had done, she was seized with fury and grief, and she raged at Temujin that he had destroyed his own blood, that a pack of dogs turned upon itself. It is a dark and terrible story to sit at the root of so great a life, but it tells us something true. Even as a boy, Temujin would remove anything that stood between him and the survival and command of those he claimed as his own. Word of the fatherless boy spread, and a rival Mongol clan, fearing that this hard-eyed youth might one day grow strong enough to seek revenge, came to seize him. They captured Temujin and clamped a heavy wooden yoke about his neck and shoulders, a kang, the kind used to shame and control a prisoner, and they held him in their camp. But even a captive Temujin was dangerous. On a night when the clan was feasting and careless, he struck the guard who watched him, knocked the man senseless with the very yoke that bound him, and fled into the darkness. He hid himself in the cold water of a river, lying with only his face above the surface among the reeds, while his captors searched the banks. One man saw him there, saw the desperate boy in the black water, and yet, moved by something like pity or admiration, said nothing and let him live. Temujin never forgot the man who had spared him. In later years, when he was master of the world, that man and his family were richly rewarded. For above all things Temujin remembered. He remembered every kindness, and he remembered every betrayal, and he repaid both with an exactness that would one day make him feared across half the earth. As Temujin grew toward manhood, he remembered the girl to whom he had been promised as a child. He rode back across the steppe to claim his bride, and he found Borte waiting, and the two were married. Her family gave as a wedding gift a magnificent coat of black sable fur, a thing of great value on the freezing steppe. Temujin, thinking carefully, did not keep this treasure for himself. Instead, he carried it as a gift to the most powerful man he could reach, a chief named Togrul, the ruler of the Kerate people, who had once been a sworn friend and blood brother of Temujin's dead father. By offering the sable coat, Temujin was reminding the old chief of that bond and asking to be taken under his protection. Togrul was pleased. He accepted the young man as a kind of adopted son, and promised to scatter his enemies and gather his scattered people back to him in that single patient act, giving away his greatest possession to buy a powerful friend. Temujin showed the genius that would carry him to the top of the world. He understood that alliances were worth more than gold, and that a man who could bind others to him would always be stronger than a man who merely hoarded. He would need that friendship soon. Not long after his marriage, a band of Merkit raiders swept down upon Temujin's small camp in a raid of revenge. For years before, his father had stolen his own bride from the Merkits, and the debt of that insult had never been paid. In the chaos, Temujin escaped onto the hills, but the raiders seized Borte and carried her away into captivity. To lose his wife so soon after winning her was a wound to the heart and to the pride. Temujin went to Togrul, and he went to a friend of his own youth, a charismatic and ambitious young Mongol named Jamukha, with whom he had twice sworn the sacred bond of Anda, of blood brotherhood, mingling their blood and exchanging gifts as boys. Together the three leaders gathered a great host and fell upon the Merkits, scattering them and burning their camps, and Temujin rode through the confusion, calling his wife's name, until at last, in the darkness and the shouting, Borte heard his voice and ran to him, and they found each other again. It was his first taste of what could be done when many riders followed one purpose. For a time after the rescue, Temujin and Jamukha lived and camped together as brothers, their peoples mingled, their friendship warm. But two such men could not share one path forever. Both were ambitious, both wished to lead. And slowly a difference grew between them that was deeper than pride. Jamukha was a man of the old ways, an aristocrat who believed the noble families should rule as they always had, that the steppe should keep its ancient order of high blood and low. Temujin, who had been abandoned by the noble families and left to starve, believed something new and dangerous. He believed that a man should rise by his loyalty and his courage and his usefulness, not by the accident of his birth. He gathered around him men of humble origin, herdsmen and orphans and outcasts like himself, and he rewarded them for their faithfulness, and he bound them to him with a loyalty deeper than blood. To the common people of the steppe, weary of being treated as property by their lords. This was an intoxicating promise, and they began to leave Jamukha and other chiefs, and ride instead to the camp of Temujin. One night, as the two camps moved together, Jamukha spoke a strange and pointed riddle about where they should pitch their tents, near the mountains or near the river, and Borte understood it as a veiled threat. On her advice, Temujin quietly gave the order, and in the darkness his people separated themselves from Jamukha's and rode away to camp apart. The friendship of the two Ondas was broken. From that night they were rivals, and in time they would be the bitterest of enemies. Two visions of what the steppe could become, contending for the soul of a people. Around Temujin now gathered an ever-growing following. Chiefs came to him and offered their allegiance. Warriors swore themselves to his service, and at last a gathering of these followers proclaimed him a Khan, a lord, and gave him a war name. But he was still only one Khan among many, still the junior partner of the great Togrul, still overshadowed by his rival Jamukha. The unification of the steppe, the thing no one had ever achieved, still lay years of blood and betrayal ahead. But the young man who had hidden in a cold river to survive was now a leader of men, and he was learning, campaign by campaign, how to turn a following into an army, and an army into a nation. The years that followed were a long and grinding contest for mastery of the steppe, a story of shifting alliances and sudden betrayals, of friendships that turned to war, and enemies who became allies for a season before turning again. Temujin fought the Tatars, the people who had poisoned his father, and when he defeated them, he did a terrible and deliberate thing. He ordered that the men of the tribe be measured against the height of a cartwheel, and that all who stood taller than the wheel, all the grown men and older boys, who might one day take up arms in revenge, be put to the sword, while the small children and the women were taken into his own people to be raised as Mongols. It was a merciless calculation, meant to erase forever the possibility of a Tatar revenge, and it worked. But it was also, in its cold way, a kind of nation-building, for the survivors were not enslaved, and cast out but absorbed, made part of the growing whole. His old protector Togrul remained his ally through much of this, and together they were nearly unstoppable. But power breeds suspicion, and voices in Togrul's camp, including Togrul's own son, who feared and resented the rising young Mongol, whispered that Temujin was growing too strong, that he must be destroyed before he destroyed them. A false offer of marriage between their families was used to lure Temujin into a trap. He was warned in time by two humble horse herders who overheard the plot and rode through the night to bring him word. And Temujin, remembering as always to reward loyalty, later raised those two herders to high honour. But the betrayal itself could not be undone. War broke out between Temujin and the man who had been as a father to him in a desperate battle. Temujin was nearly destroyed, his forces shattered and scattered, and he fled with only a handful of followers to the muddy waters of a distant lake. There, at the lowest point of his fortunes, he and his few remaining companions drank the muddy water together and swore an oath of undying loyalty, a bond that became legendary among the Mongols, the pledge of the men who had stayed when all others fled. From that ruin he rebuilt, patiently, cleverly, and at last he turned upon the Kerates and destroyed them. And old Togrul, once the most powerful man on the steppe, died a fugitive, killed by strangers who did not even recognize him. One by one the great tribes fell. The Naimans, a powerful western people, gathered the last of Temujin's enemies to them, including his old Anda, Jamuka, who had wandered from alliance to alliance, and now made his final stand against the man he had once loved as a brother. In the great battle that followed, Temujin's disciplined riders broke the Naiman host, and Jamuka fled into the mountains with a few companions. But even those companions had grown tired of a losing cause, and they seized Jamuka and delivered him bound to Temujin, hoping for a reward. Temujin's answer told the whole story of what he had become. He ordered the men who had betrayed their own lord to be executed before Jamuka's eyes. For a man who would betray his master could never be trusted, no matter how useful the betrayal. Then he offered his old brother his life and his friendship one more time. But Jamuka refused. He said there could not be two suns in the sky, nor two lords over one people, and he asked only for a noble death, to be killed without the shedding of his blood, as befitted a man of high birth. Temujin granted the request, and Jamuka was put to death in the honourable way and buried with respect. The last great rival was gone. In the year 1206, on the banks of a river, in the heartland of the steppe, all the peoples of the grasslands gathered for a great assembly, a Kurultai, and there they raised a white banner of 9 tails, and proclaimed Temujin the supreme ruler of all who lived in tents of felt. They gave him a new and awesome title, no longer merely a Khan among Khans. He was to be Genghis Khan, a name whose meaning has been argued over for centuries, but which carries the sense of a fierce and oceanic and universal ruler, a lord as vast and unbounded as the sea. He was perhaps 44 years of age. The abandoned boy who had hidden in a river was now the master of a united nation of horsemen. A nation such as the steppe had never seen, welded together not by blood or tribe, but by his own iron will and his own new law, and that nation hardened by 1,000 years of survival, and now for the first time pointing all its terrible energy in a single direction, was about to be turned outward against the great settled empires of the world. To understand how a scattered people of perhaps 1,000,000 souls came to conquer much of the known world, we must understand the machine that Genghis Khan built out of them. For it was a machine, in a way no army before it had ever been, and its design was the quiet secret behind every thunderclap of conquest that was to follow. The old steppe armies had been loose gatherings of warriors following their own tribal chiefs, brave but undisciplined, likely to break off a battle, to plunder or to chase glory. Genghis swept all of that away. He broke apart the old tribes deliberately, mixing men of different origins together, so that their loyalty could no longer be to Tatar, or Naiman, or Merkit, but only to the army and to him. He organised his warriors upon a simple and brilliant system built on the number 10. The smallest unit was 10 men, who lived and fought and died together as brothers. 10 of these made a company of 100. 10 companies made a regiment of 1,000. And 10 regiments made a tumen, a division of 10,000, the great mass that moved across the world like a living thing. Every man knew his place in this structure exactly. If one man fled from battle, his entire unit of 10 could be executed, so that each warrior was bound to his fellows by the certainty that cowardice meant death for all. And over the whole army, Genghis set commanders, chosen not for their noble birth, but for their skill, common men raised to lead thousands, because they had proven themselves worthy. A Gothard could rise to command a tumen. Loyalty and ability were the only currency that mattered. The Mongol soldier carried the whole steppe within him. He needed no supply train of wagons, no slow-moving stores of food, for he lived as he had always lived, off his horses and his herds and the land. Each warrior brought with him a string of several horses, riding one until it tired, and then leaping to the next, so that the army could move at a speed that seemed to their enemies almost supernatural, covering distances in days that a settled army would take weeks to cross. When food ran short, a man might open a small vein in his horse's neck and drink a little of its blood, then close the wound so that his mount fed him as well as carried him. He carried dried meat and dried curds that could be softened in water, and he could go far and fast on almost nothing. His great weapon was the bow, the Mongol composite bow, made of layers of horn and wood and sinew glued and bound together, was small enough to be fired from the saddle, yet so powerful that its arrows could pierce armour at a great distance. A Mongol could shoot with terrifying accuracy while riding at a full gallop, loosing his arrow in the instant when all 4 of his horse's hooves left the ground, so that the aim was not spoiled by the animal's motion. In battle, the Mongols did not charge blindly into their enemies. They swirled and circled at a distance like a storm, filling the air with arrows, wearing down the foe before ever closing to strike. And they were masters of the false retreat, pretending to flee in panic, to draw a proud enemy into a headlong pursuit, then turning suddenly upon the scattered and exhausted pursuers to destroy them. Again and again this simple trick worked, for men who believed they were winning could not imagine they were being led into a trap. Above all, the Mongol army was disciplined and it was coordinated. Genghis and his generals directed their divisions with signal flags by day, and with burning torches and drums by night, so that masses of horsemen spread across many miles of country could move as if guided by a single mind, converging upon an enemy from several directions at once by prior arrangement, appearing suddenly where they were least expected. Scouts ranged far ahead, gathering knowledge of the land and the foe. For Genghis prized information above almost anything. He wished to know his enemy's strength, his roads, his water, his weaknesses, before ever a battle was joined, and binding all of this together was the law. Genghis gave his people a code, a body of rules and judgments known as the Yasa, which was proclaimed and enforced with an even hand that fell as heavily upon the great as upon the small. The law forbade theft among the Mongols, and the abandonment of a comrade, and the breaking of an oath. It regulated the hunt and the division of spoils, and the treatment of envoys, and the practice of the many faiths the empire came to hold. It made the steppe, for the first time in memory, a place of order rather than endless private feud. It was said that under the peace Genghis imposed, a traveller could cross his lands from one end to the other, carrying a sack of gold upon his head, and never be robbed, for the punishment was too certain and too severe. This was the instrument he had forged. Not merely an army, but a nation under arms, mobile, disciplined, hungry, and utterly obedient to one will. Now that Will turned to look beyond the grass, toward the rich and settled lands, where his people had always been poor cousins, and it saw not walls and gates, but opportunity without limit. There was one great ritual above all others, by which the Mongols kept their warriors sharp for war, even in the seasons of peace, and it tells us much about the strange and total disciplines of this people. It was the winter hunt, an enormous and elaborate affair that the Mongols called the Neige, and it was far more than a search for meat. It was a campaign in all but name, a rehearsal for battle in which an entire army might take part. At the appointed time, thousands upon thousands of horsemen would spread themselves out in a vast line, stretching for many miles across the grasslands. And then, over days and even weeks, they would advance slowly forward, driving before them every living creature in their path. The deer and the wild asses and the wolves and the foxes and the hares and the great herds of gazelle, sweeping them all ahead like a slowly closing net. The two ends of the immense line would gradually curve inward, bending around until at last they met, forming a vast ring many miles across, inside which the terrified animals were trapped in a heaving mass. The discipline this required was absolute, across enormous distances of open country. The riders had to keep their line unbroken, moving neither too fast nor too slow, allowing not a single animal to slip through the ranks, for a man who let a beast escape might be punished as severely as a soldier who abandoned his post in battle. Commanders directed the whole vast operation with signals and messengers, exactly as they would direct an army in the field, coordinating movements across a front so wide that no one man could see from one end to the other. When at last the great ring was closed and the trapped animals milled in panic at the centre, the Khan himself would ride in first to make the opening kills, and then the slaughter would proceed by careful order until, near the end, the surviving beasts might be spared and released to breed for future years. Through this, the Mongols practiced everything they would need in war: the coordination of masses of men across great distances, the encirclement of an enemy, the patience of the long advance, the obedience to signals, the art of the closing trap. When such men rode against a human enemy, they were doing only what they had done 100 times against the wild herds of the steppe, and they did it with the same relentless and unhurried certainty. This same terrible patience showed itself in the way the Mongols made war upon the settled peoples, and above all, in the way they wielded fear as a weapon as sharp as any sword. When a Mongol army approached a city, it did not always begin at once with the assault. Often it began with a choice offered to the defenders. submission and life, or resistance and annihilation, and the choice was made real by the fate of every town that had chosen wrongly before. The Mongols cultivated their fearsome reputation deliberately. For a city that opened its gates in terror cost them no soldiers and no time. And a reputation for merciless destruction was worth more than an extra arm. When they did storm a place that had resisted, the horror they inflicted was not mere blind savagery, but a message written in fire and blood for every other city to read, so that the news would race ahead of them and open a dozen gates without a blow. It was a cold and deliberate calculation, and it was one of the most effective instruments of conquest ever devised, for it turned the enemy's own fear into the conqueror's ally. And so, armed with discipline and speed, and the composite bow hardened by the great hunts, and preceded everywhere by a reputation for terror, the Mongol army turned outward to fall upon the settled world. At the head of this army stood a man whose personality we can only glimpse dimly across the centuries. For the Mongols left few writings of their own, and most of what we know of Genghis Khan comes from the pens of the peoples he conquered, or from a single remarkable chronicle, composed after his death, that his own people preserved. From these scattered glimpses there emerges a figure of great and sober intelligence, a man who spoke little and listened much, who valued deeds far above words, who despised drunkenness and excess, even as many of his sons and grandsons fell prey to the wine that would in time weaken his line. He surrounded himself with able men and rewarded them lavishly, and he had a gift rare in any age for recognizing talent wherever he found it and raising it up regardless of its origin. Some of his greatest generals had begun as his enemies. Jebi, whose name means the arrow, had once, fighting on the other side in the wars of the steppe, loosed the very arrow that struck and killed Genghis's own warhorse beneath him. When this man was captured and brought before him, and freely admitted the deed, Genghis, instead of ordering his death, was so impressed by his honesty and his skill that he took him into his own service and made him one of his foremost commanders. A lesser man would have taken revenge. Genghis took an asset and gained one of the finest soldiers of the age. Around him gathered a company of extraordinary companions, men the chroniclers remembered as his 4 steeds and his 4 hounds, the commanders and the loyal friends who had ridden with him from the lean early days, and who carried out his conquests across the world. Subutai, greatest of them all, the son of a humble family who became perhaps the most successful general in all of history, planning and winning campaigns from China to the borders of Germany, a man who is said to have directed more than 20 campaigns and never lost. Mukhali, whom Genghis trusted so completely that he left him to conduct the entire war in China with an independent command, while the Khan himself went west. Borchu and Jelme, friends of his youth who had come to him when he had nothing, and stood by him when others fled. These were the men who translated the will of one Khan into the conquest of a world, and the loyalty that bound them to him and to one another was the true foundation of everything the Mongols achieved, the thing that Genghis had learned to prize above all else in the cold and hungry years of his abandoned childhood. For that childhood was never far beneath the surface of the man he became. He who had been betrayed and abandoned as a boy built an empire upon the principle that betrayal was the one unforgivable crime, and that loyalty must be rewarded and treachery punished with an exactness that never wavered. Time and again in his life he spared or honoured those who had been faithful even to his enemies, and put to death those who had betrayed their own masters to gain his favour. For a traitor once was a traitor always, and he who had known what it was To have nothing gave generously to his followers, sharing out the plunder of the world among the men who had won it, for he understood that an army rewarded is an army that follows, and that a leader who kept everything for himself would soon find himself alone. In all of this, there was a kind of harsh and consistent wisdom, a code forged in suffering and applied without mercy or exception, and it made him not merely a conqueror, but the founder of a lasting order. He is remembered for the cities he destroyed, and rightly, but he should also be remembered as one of the shrewdest judges of men who ever lived, and as the architect of a system so sound that it carried his heirs onward to conquests he himself never dreamed of, the first of the great settled powers. To feel the weight of the united Mongols lay to the south and west, a kingdom called Western Xia, ruled by a people known as the Tangut, dwelling in the dry lands along the great bend of the Yellow River. It was a wealthy realm of walled cities and irrigated fields and busy trade, and it made a tempting first target, a chance for the Mongols to learn the difficult art they had never needed on the open steppe, the art of taking a fortified town. For a people who had never in their history besieged a city, this was a formidable challenge. A horseman is helpless before a high stone wall. His bow cannot bring it down, his horse cannot leap it, and the defenders behind it can rain destruction upon him while he stands frustrated below. The Mongols learned. They were the most adaptable conquerors the world has known, and whenever they met a skill they lacked, they simply took it from those who had it. Captured engineers and craftsmen from the settled lands were pressed into Mongol service and set to building the great engines of siege, the catapults that hurled stones of burning naphtha, the towers and ladders and battering rams. When the Mongols could not break the walls of the Tangut capital by force, they tried instead to divert the waters of the river, to flood the city into surrender, a scheme that half worked and half drowned their own camp before they withdrew. But the lesson was learned, and the Tangut king was frightened into submission and tribute. The Mongols had blooded themselves against a walled kingdom and survived, and they had begun to gather the tools and the knowledge that would soon make no wall safe from them anywhere on earth. Then Genghis turned his gaze upon a far greater prize. To the east and south lay northern China, ruled by the Jin dynasty, a mighty empire of tens of millions of people, of vast cities and teeming farmland, of an ancient and sophisticated civilization that regarded the Mongols as little more than savage barbarians, fit only to send tribute and stay beyond the frontier. The Jin had long kept the steppe tribes weak and divided by playing one against another, and they did not at first understand that the old game was over, that the many quarrelling peoples they had manipulated for generations were now welded into a single deadly host under one man, who remembered every insult. Genghis crossed the frontier and fell upon the Jin lands like a flood. His horsemen poured through the passes and spread across the northern plains, storming towns, scattering armies, filling the roads with refugees fleeing toward the great fortified cities. The Jin had a huge army and immense resources, far greater on paper than anything the Mongols possessed. But they were slow, and they were divided in their councils, and they could not match the speed and the coordination and the sheer ferocious will of the invaders. Battle after battle went against them. The Mongols learned to storm the smaller cities and to blockade and starve the greater ones. They were merciless to any place that resisted, for terror was itself a weapon in the Mongol art of war. A city that surrendered at once might be spared, its people made subjects, and its craftsmen taken into service. But a city that shut its gates and fought was, if it fell, given over to slaughter and flame, so that the news of its fate would race ahead of the Mongol army and open the gates of the next town without a blow. Fear did much of their conquering for them. At last the Mongols came before the greatest city of the north, the Jin capital, a vast metropolis of enormous walls and countless people, one of the largest cities on earth. Even the Mongols could not simply storm such a place. They surrounded it and cut it off, and inside the walls the horror of a long siege unfolded, hunger and disease and despair, until the defenders were reduced to their last extremity. In time the great city fell, and it was given over to a sack so complete that it was said the ground was greasy with human fat, and the streets choked with the dead, and the fires burned for a month. It was a catastrophe on a scale the world had rarely witnessed, and it announced to all of Asia that a new and terrible power had risen out of the grass. Genghis did not conquer all of the Jin realm at once, for northern China was too vast to swallow in a single campaign, and he left the finishing of that long war to others while he turned to face a sudden and unexpected challenge in the west. But the pattern of the Mongol conquests was now fixed. Speed, terror, adaptability, and an utter refusal to forgive resistance. The barbarians from beyond the wall had become the masters of the north. Far to the west of the Mongol homeland, beyond the deserts and the mountains, lay one of the richest and most brilliant civilizations of the age, the Empire of Khwarezm. It stretched across the heart of Central Asia and into Persia, a land of fabled cities whose names still ring with a kind of enchantment. Samarkand and Bukhara and Urgench and Merv, cities of libraries and gardens, and blue-tiled domes of scholars and poets and merchants grown wealthy on the trade that flowed along the Silk Road. Its ruler, the Shah, commanded a great army and believed himself among the mightiest monarchs on earth. Genghis, at this time, did not want war with him. He wanted trade. He sent envoys proposing peace and commerce between their realms, and he dispatched a great caravan of merchants laden with goods to open the road between the two empires. The caravan reached a frontier city of the Khwarezmian Empire called Otrar, and there the governor of the city, a proud and greedy man, seized the merchants, accused them of being spies, and had them all put to death, keeping their rich goods for himself. It was an act of monstrous folly. When word reached Genghis, he did not at once fly into war. He sent an embassy to the Shah himself, demanding that the guilty governor be handed over for punishment. The Shah, arrogant and dismissive of the barbarian from the east, refused. Worse, he had the chief envoy killed and the others shamefully mutilated and sent back with their beards burned off. To murder a merchant caravan was a crime. To murder an ambassador, in the eyes of the Mongols, was an unforgivable violation of the most sacred law, a wound that could be answered only in blood, and in blood on a scale the world had never imagined. The wrath that Genghis Khan brought down upon the Empire of Khwarezm was one of the most terrible episodes in all of human history. He gathered a vast host, perhaps 100,000 riders and more, and led them himself across thousands of miles of desert and mountain, appearing before the astonished defenders. As if the earth itself had opened, the Shah, fatally, chose to scatter his large army among his many cities, rather than meet the Mongols in one great battle. And so Genghis was able to destroy the empire piece by piece, bringing his whole strength against each city in turn. And where he found resistance, he was without mercy. The frontier city of Otrar, where the crime had begun, was taken after a long siege, and the governor who had killed the merchants was, the stories say, put to death by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a fitting end for a man whose greed had brought ruin upon millions. City after glorious city fell. At Bukhara, a jewel of Islamic learning, Genghis is said to have ridden his horse into the great mosque and declared himself the punishment of God. Sent because the people had committed great sins, the city was plundered, and much of it burned, its people driven out, its treasures scattered. Samarkand, greater still, held out only a little longer, before it too was taken and sacked, but it was the cities that fought hardest that suffered most. At Urgench and at Nishapur and at Merv, once among the largest and most cultured cities in the world, the Mongols, enraged by fierce resistance and by the death of one of Genghis's own sons-in-law before the walls, carried out slaughters so vast that the medieval chroniclers, groping for words, wrote of hundreds of thousands, and even more than 1,000,000 dead, of pyramids of skulls raised outside the ruins, of great libraries burned and irrigation canals broken so that fertile land returned to desert. We cannot fully trust these enormous numbers, for terror multiplies itself in the telling, and a conqueror was well served by a reputation that emptied cities before he even arrived. But there is no doubt that the destruction was real and immense, that flourishing centres of learning and beauty were reduced to rubble and ash, and that some of them never recovered their greatness across all the centuries that followed. The Shah himself, his empire collapsing around him, fled westward in panic, with a Mongol column hunting him tirelessly across the whole breadth of his realm. He found no refuge. City after city closed its gates to a broken king who could no longer protect anyone, and at last, hunted, exhausted, abandoned by almost all, he died alone and destitute on a small island in a distant sea, so poor at the end that there was scarcely a shroud to wrap his body. His empire, which had seemed one of the mightiest in the world, had been erased in the space of a few short years, all because of the arrogance and greed of one frontier governor and one proud king, who had not understood the storm they were provoking, and the Mongol columns, having shattered Khwarezm, rode on further still. One great reconnaissance sweeping around the shores of a distant sea, through the Caucasus Mountains, and out onto the plains of the far west, where they met and crushed the armies of peoples the Mongols had never before heard named, before turning at last for home. The world had grown suddenly frighteningly small, and no distance any longer seemed to lie beyond the reach of the riders from the grass. That great sweep around the far seas deserves to be remembered on its own, for it was one of the most extraordinary feats of arms in all of history, a raid so audacious and so far-reaching that it seems almost impossible even now. While Genghis himself completed the destruction of Khwarezm, he had detached 2 of his finest generals, Jabeh and the incomparable Subutai, with a force of perhaps 20,000 riders, and given them leave to pursue the fleeing Shah, and then to explore the unknown lands beyond, to see what peoples and what kingdoms lay in the great blank spaces of the West. What followed was a journey of thousands of miles, through lands no Mongol had ever seen, a cavalry column cut loose entirely from its home, living off the country, fighting whoever stood in its way, gathering knowledge as it went, and always moving across a continent. They rode through northern Persia, storming cities and scattering armies. They pushed on into the mountains of the Caucasus, that tangled country of high peaks and fierce tribes, and there they met a coalition of local peoples gathered to bar their way. Outnumbered and in unfamiliar terrain, the 2 generals used cunning where they could not use force, sending gifts and honeyed messages to divide their enemies, persuading one part of the alliance to abandon the other with promises of friendship and plunder. And then, once the coalition had broken apart, falling upon each piece in turn and destroying it, and turning at last upon the very allies they had bribed and crushing them too. Through the mountains they came, out onto the wide plains beyond, and there they encountered a new people, the nomadic horsemen of the southern Russian steppe, and beat them, and drove their survivors, fleeing westward to beg help from the Christian princes of the Rus, the princes of the Rus, a proud and quarrelsome collection of rulers who had never heard the name of the Mongols, gathered a great army to meet this strange new enemy that had appeared as if from nowhere out of the east. In the year 1223, on the banks of a river called the Kalka, the two hosts came together, and the Mongols showed the Rus for the first time the deadly art that had already conquered half a continent. They fell back before the advancing Christian arm in a long, feigned retreat, drawing the eager and disorganized Rus forces further and further from their supports, stretching them out and tiring them across days of pursuit, until, at the chosen moment, the Mongols turned and struck the scattered enemy to pieces. The defeat was catastrophic. Many of the Rus princes were killed, and the Mongols, it is told, celebrated their victory by feasting upon a platform built over the bodies of the captured princes, crushing them slowly beneath the weight of the feast, so that they might die without the shedding of their noble blood, as the Mongol custom required for men of high rank. And then, having won this stunning victory in a land no Mongol army had ever entered, Jebe and Subutai simply turned around and rode home thousands of miles back across the steppes and deserts to rejoin the main army, completing one of the longest and most remarkable cavalry expeditions ever undertaken. They had ridden entirely around a great sea, through more than a dozen kingdoms, fighting all the way, and they had returned with an invaluable knowledge of the lands and the peoples and the roads of the West. Knowledge that would be used. Years later, when the Mongols came back to those same plains not as raiders but as conquerors, the princes of the Rus, once the terror had passed and the strangers had vanished as suddenly as they had come, tried to persuade themselves that it had been some passing scourge that would never return. They were terribly wrong. Subutai remembered every river and every road, and he would come again. Genghis Khan returned from the west, an old man, weary from a lifetime in the saddle, but his work was not finished, and there remained one account still to settle. Years before, when he had first ridden against the empire of Khwarezm, he had asked the Tangut kingdom of western Shiar, which he counted as a vassal, to send troops to join his campaign. The Tangut had insolently refused, and one of their ministers had even sent back a mocking reply, taunting that if Genghis could not conquer his enemies without their help, then he was not fit to be called a Khan at all. Genghis did not forget, he never forgot. And now his western wars concluded. He gathered his armies once more and turned them against the kingdom that had scorned him, resolved this time to wipe it from the face of the earth. The campaign against the Tangut was hard and bitter, fought through a difficult country of desert and mountain and walled towns. But it was going in the Mongols' favour when, in the year 1227, in the midst of the war, Genghis Khan fell ill and died. He was old, perhaps in his middle 60s, and the stories of exactly how he met his end are many and uncertain. Some say he was thrown from his horse while hunting and never recovered from the injury. Some say he sickened with a fever, others tell darker and more legendary tales. But whatever the true cause, the man who had risen from a starving outcast to become the ruler of the largest empire ever assembled by a single conqueror passed from the world out on campaign as he had lived, with his armies around him and an enemy still before him. His death was kept secret. The Tangut capital was on the point of surrender, and the Mongols feared that news of the great Khan's passing might give the defenders fresh heart to resist, so the death was hidden, and the war was pressed to its conclusion. And when, at last, the Tangut king came out to submit, he was put to death, and the city and much of the kingdom were given over to a destruction so thorough that the Tangut people and their distinct civilization were all but erased from history, their kingdom vanishing so completely that later generations scarcely remembered it had existed. Thus was the mockery of the taunting minister repaid in the total extinction of a nation. The body of Genghis Khan was carried home to the steppe he had come from, to be buried in the land of grass and wind that had made him. And here, history gives way almost entirely to legend, for the place of his grave is one of the great mysteries of the world, unknown to this day. The Mongols wished their founder to rest undisturbed forever. And so, the old tales say, they took the greatest care to hide the sight from all eyes. It is said that the funeral escort killed every person they met upon the road, as they carried the body to its resting place, so that none could reveal the way. It is said that after the burial, in some secret spot among the mountains, or upon the open plain, 1,000 horsemen rode back and forth across the ground until every trace of the grave was trampled away, and the earth lay smooth and undisturbed, and that trees were planted or a river was turned to run above it, and that the men who had done this work were themselves later killed, so that in the end no living soul knew where the conqueror of the world lay sleeping. For 8 centuries, searchers and scholars and treasure hunters have looked in vain. The steppe has kept its secret. Somewhere, beneath the grass that never stops moving in the wind, the greatest conqueror in the history of mankind lies in an unmarked grave, as anonymous in death as he had been at his hungry, fatherless beginning. But the empire did not die with him. Before his end, Genghis had thought carefully about what would come after, for he had seen with his own eyes, in his own childhood, how quickly a leaderless people could fall to pieces. He had many sons, and rather than let them tear the empire apart in a war of succession, he had assigned to each of them a share of the conquered lands to rule, great territories that would in time become distinct kingdoms of their own, and, above them all, he named a successor to hold the title of Great Khan, choosing not his eldest but a son he judged steady and capable, a son named Ogedei, generous, easygoing, fond of wine and of feasting, but wise enough to keep his father's law and his father's generals, and to send the armies rolling onward. So the passing of Genghis Khan, which might have shattered everything he had built, instead became merely a pause. The nation held together, the machine kept running, and under his sons and grandsons, the empire that one man had raised out of nothing was about to grow larger, still, spreading across the world until it touched the edges of continents its founder had never even known existed. Under Ogedei, the second great Khan, the empire entered its years of greatest expansion, reaching outward in every direction, at once with a confidence that seemed to know no limit. In the east, the long war against the Jin dynasty of northern China was at last brought to its bloody end, the last Jin emperor dying amid the ruin of his final refuge, and all of the north passing under Mongol rule. But it was in the west that the most astonishing campaign of the age unfolded, a campaign that carried the horsemen of the steppe deeper into Europe than any conqueror from the east had ever come, and that left the kingdoms of Christendom trembling before an enemy they did not understand and could not stop. The great western expedition was led in name by Genghis's grandson Batu, a capable prince, but its true genius was the aging general Subutai, who had ridden at Genghis Khan's side from the earliest days, and who was perhaps the finest commander the Mongols ever produced, a man who had never lost a campaign in a lifetime of war. Together they gathered a mighty host and swept first into the lands of the Rus, the scattered principalities that would one day become Russia, a patchwork of proud but disunited cities that could not combine against the common threat. One by one the Rus cities fell, storm and slaughter and fire, until the Mongols came before the greatest of them all, the golden city of Kiev, mother of the Rus, and stormed it and sacked it so terribly that a traveller passing through the region some years later found the land almost empty of people, and the ground still white with the scattered bones of the dead. The Rus lands were beaten into submission, and would remain under the Mongol yoke, paying tribute to the Khans for 200 years and more, a domination whose long shadow shaped the history of Russia for centuries. Then Subutai did the thing that no one believed possible. In the depths of winter, when settled armies always went into their quarters and waited for spring, the Mongols used the frozen rivers as highways and drove westward into the heart of Europe. They divided their forces with breathtaking daring, sending one army north into Poland and the German lands to guard their flank, while the main host, under Subutai, plunged into the rich kingdom of Hungary. The northern army met the assembled knights of Poland and their allies and destroyed them utterly in a great battle, the flower of Western chivalry cut down by the swirling arrows and the false retreats of an enemy whose way of war they could not comprehend. And in Hungary, Subutai lured the great army of the Hungarian king into a trap beside a river, surrounded it, and annihilated it in a single dreadful day, leaving the roads for miles strewn with the bodies of the fallen. The king fled for his life. Two of the proudest kingdoms of Europe had been shattered within days of each other by armies operating hundreds of miles apart in perfect coordination, and there seemed to be nothing left between the Mongols and the Western Sea. The chroniclers of Europe wrote in genuine terror that the end of the world had come, that a demonic people had burst forth from the unknown lands of the East to destroy Christendom, and prayers were said in churches from Italy to England for deliverance from the Tartars, as they called them, a name that carried within it the word for hell. And then, at the very moment when Western Europe seemed to lie open and defenceless before them, the Mongols turned around and rode away. The reason had nothing to do with any army that could stop them, for none could. Far away, in the heart of the empire, the great Khan Ogedei had died, worn out at last by his love of wine, and by the law of the Mongols, the princes of the blood, including Batu, were required to return to the homeland to take part in choosing a new great Khan. And so, with all of Europe at their mercy, the horsemen wheeled their mounts and streamed back toward the east, leaving the shaken kingdoms of the west to marvel at their deliverance and to give thanks for a mercy they did not understand. Europe never knew how close it had come, nor how little the withdrawal had to do with its own strength. The Mongols would trouble the West again in the years to come, but never again with such overwhelming force. And the high watermark of their advance into Europe receded like a tide going out. The empire had reached its farthest western reach, an empire that now stretched almost beyond belief. From the Pacific Ocean in the east to the plains of Hungary in the west, the largest continuous land empire that had ever existed, or ever would. And having conquered so vast a portion of the world, the Mongols now faced a question harder in its way than any battle. Having taken the world, how were they to rule it? We remember the Mongols first and most for their conquests, for the terror and the burning cities and the pyramids of skulls. But that is only half of the story, and to leave it there would be to misunderstand what they built. For once the fighting was done, and the resistance broken, the Mongols proved to be rulers of a strange and remarkable kind, and across the enormous span of their empire. In the decades that followed the great conquests, there settled a peace and an order that historians have called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was one of the great paradoxes of history that a people who had shed so much blood in the taking of the world should then make so much of that world safer and more open than it had ever been before. The heart of the matter was trade, and the roads that trade travelled. For centuries, the Silk Road, the ancient network of caravan routes that linked China to Persia, and Persia to the shores of the Mediterranean, had been broken up among dozens of quarrelling kingdoms and bandit-haunted frontiers, so that goods passed only slowly and dangerously from hand to hand, taxed and robbed at every border. Now, for the first time, that entire vast length of road lay under a single authority, guarded by a single fierce law. The Mongols, who produced few luxuries of their own, and loved the fine goods of the settled lands, understood that merchants were worth more alive and prosperous than dead, and they protected the trade routes, Niwand, with the same ferocity they had once used to destroy them. A merchant could load his camels in China and travel all the way to the markets of Persia or the Black Sea under the protection of the Khan's peace. And the old boast returned that a maiden bearing a nugget of gold upon her head could travel unharmed across the length of the empire. Silk and porcelain and spices flowed west, silver and fine glass and new techniques and ideas flowed east. Cities that lay upon the great roads grew rich as they had never been. To hold so vast a realm together, the Mongols built a communication system that was one of the wonders of the age, a relay network they called the Yam. Across the whole breadth of the empire, at intervals of a day's hard ride, they established stations stocked with fresh horses and food and shelter. A messenger of the Khan, carrying a special tablet of authority that commanded the obedience of all, could ride into a station, hand over his message, or simply exchange his tired mount for a fresh one, and gallop onward. And in this way news and orders could travel across thousands of miles with astonishing speed, hundreds of miles in a single day. When the need was urgent, the riders, sometimes bound tightly in bandages, to hold their exhausted bodies together as they raced through the night. Through this web of galloping horses, one mind at the centre could feel the pulse of an empire that spanned a continent, and could send its will racing out to the farthest frontier. It was, in its way, the nervous system of the largest state the world had ever known. Stranger still to the settled peoples was the Mongol attitude toward religion. The Mongols themselves followed the old shamanist beliefs of the steppe, worshipping the eternal blue sky above all, honouring the spirits of the land and the ancestors. But they did not try to force these beliefs upon the peoples they ruled, and in an age when Christians and Muslims and others slaughtered one another over questions of faith, the Mongols practiced a policy of broad tolerance that astonished the world. In the courts of the Khans, Buddhist monks and Muslim scholars and Christian priests and Taoist sages could be found debating and serving, and side by side, their persons protected, their clergy freed from taxes, their prayers welcomed as potentially useful to a Khan who saw no reason to offend any god who might be real. This was not tolerance born of gentleness, but of a shrewd and practical wisdom, a recognition that a peaceful and contented population of many faiths was easier to rule and to tax than one goaded into rebellion by persecution. And yet, whatever its origin, it made the Mongol Empire a place where ideas and peoples and beliefs met and mingled across distances that had never been crossed before. At the centre of all this, out on the Mongolian steppe, Ogedei had raised a capital, a city called Karakorum, and though it was small and unimpressive compared to the ancient metropolises the Mongols had conquered, it was one of the most extraordinary places on earth, for into it flowed the tribute and the talent and the travellers of half the world. Craftsmen carried off from a dozen conquered lands laboured there. Envoys came from distant kings. A captured French goldsmith built for the Khan a great silver tree, with pipes that poured out different drinks, wine and fermented mare's milk and honey mead at the command of the court. In the markets of this raw new city on the grass, one might hear a dozen languages spoken and see the faces and the costumes of peoples from every corner of the known world. The empire had become a bridge, across which the two ends of a continent which had known each other before only as rumour could at last touch, and it was into this connected world, this vast and briefly peaceful realm knit together by galloping horses and guarded roads, that the most famous traveller of the age would soon come to serve the greatest of all the Khans yet to reign. It is worth pausing here, amid the marching of armies and the falling of cities, to remember the ordinary life that continued all the while. Beneath the great events, the life of the herdsman and the mother and the child out on the grass, which went on much as it always had, even as their kinsmen conquered the world. For all their power, the Mongols at heart remained a people of the tent, and the herd, and the rhythms of that life changed little. Whether their Khan ruled a single valley or half the earth, the round tent of felt, the ger, remained the centre of every family's world, a marvel of simple design. Warm in the killing cold of winter and cool in the fierce heat of summer, its lattice frame and its covering of thick felt able to be raised or struck down in the space of an hour. Inside, all was ordered by custom, the place of honour at the back, opposite the door, the men's side and the women's side, the hearth at the centre with its fire, for on the treeless steppe, the dried dung of the animals was the fuel that kept a family alive through the long dark months. The food was the food of the herds. In the warm months, when the mares gave milk, the Mongols drank deeply of it, and let much of it ferment into their beloved sour drink, and made from it dried curds hard as stone that could be carried on the longest journey and softened in water when needed. In the cold months they ate the flesh of their animals, and of the hunt, and little went to waste, for on the steppe waste was death, and every part of a slaughtered beast had its use, the meat for food, the hide for leather, the wool and hair for felt and rope, the bones and sinew for tools and for the making of their bows, the very dung for fire. A child of the steppe learned all of this young, learned to ride and to shoot and to herd and to endure, learned to read the weather and the grass and the movements of the animals, learned the hard wisdom of a life, lived always on the edge of survival, where a single terrible winter, a great freeze that locked the grass beneath a crust of ice, so that the herds starved, could destroy a family utterly. This was the world that had made the conquerors, and it was the world they carried in their hearts, even when they sat upon the thrones of ancient kingdoms, a world of open sky and moving herds and the endless patient grass. And in a strange way, the conquests changed this ancient life, less than one might think, for even as the Khans in their distant palaces adopted the robes and the customs of China or of Persia, the common people of the steppe went on herding their animals and following the seasons as their ancestors had done for 1,000 years before Genghis, and would do for 1,000 years after him. The empire rose and the empire fell, but the grass remained, and the wind remained, and the round tents still dotted the vast grasslands, and the children were still born in the saddle and raised to the sound of the wind. There is something quieting in that thought, that beneath all the thunder of the greatest conquest in history, there flowed on, unbroken, the slow and patient and enduring life of a people and a land that had shaped a boy into the master of the world, and that outlasted, in the end, everything he built. After Ogedei, there came a time of uncertainty, of regents and rivalries among the branches of the great family, until at last the title of Great Khan passed to Mongol, a grandson of Genghis, a stern and capable ruler, determined to renew the wars of conquest that had slowed during the years of quarrelling. Mongol set two of his brothers to the two greatest tasks remaining in the world. To one brother, Kublai, he gave the long, unfinished war against the rich southern Chinese empire of the Song, and to another brother, Hulagu, he gave the West and the command to bring the whole of the Islamic heartland, Persia and Mesopotamia, and beyond, fully under Mongol rule. Hulagu gathered one of the largest armies the Mongols had ever assembled and marched westward with terrible purpose. His first great target was a shadowy and feared power that had troubled the region for generations, an order of religious warriors who dwelt in a chain of nearly impregnable mountain fortresses, and who had made themselves dreaded through the practice of sending trained killers to murder any ruler who opposed them, the sect the wider world came to call the Assassins. Their strongholds perched upon crags so high and steep that they had defied every army sent against them for a century and a half. But the Mongols brought with them Chinese siege engineers and a patience and a strength of numbers that no one had ever mustered against the mountain fortresses before, and one by one the eagle's nests of the assassins were reduced, their master taken and later killed, their power broken forever. A terror that had haunted the region for generations was extinguished in a single campaign. Then Hulagu turned toward the greatest prize of all, the city of Baghdad, the seat of the Caliph, the spiritual head of much of the Islamic world, a city that for 5 centuries had been the shining centre of learning and culture and faith, a place of libraries and universities and hospitals whose scholars had preserved and advanced the knowledge of the ancient world. The Caliph, proud of his sacred office, and certain that no force on earth would dare to destroy the holy city or harm the successor of the Prophet, refused Hulagu's demands for submission with contempt, and did little to prepare his defences. Trusting in his prestige and in a god he was sure would not permit such a sacrilege, he was terribly mistaken. In the year 1258, Hulagu surrounded Baghdad, broke its defences with his siege engines, and stormed the city. What followed was one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of civilization. The Mongols sacked Baghdad for days, killing its inhabitants in numbers the chroniclers reckoned in the hundreds of thousands, plundering its palaces, plundering its palatines, and destroying its incomparable libraries and houses of wisdom. It was said that the waters of the river that ran through the city turned black with the ink of the countless books thrown into it, and red with the blood of the slain, and that the accumulated learning of 500 years was lost in an afternoon. The last caliph of that ancient line was put to death, and it is told that the Mongols, forbidden by their own custom from spilling royal blood upon the ground, rolled him in a carpet and had him trampled beneath the hooves of horses, so that no drop of his blood should touch the earth. The fall of Baghdad sent a wave of grief and horror across the whole Islamic world, and it marked the end of an age. The golden centuries of the caliphate were over, and though Islamic civilization would recover and flourish again in other places, the loss of that great city was a wound from which some things never healed. Hulagu pressed on into Syria, taking the ancient cities of the region, and it seemed for a moment that the whole of the Islamic Middle East, and perhaps the lands beyond, might fall to the Mongols as everything else had fallen. But then, once again, the death of a great Khan reached across the world to change the course of history. Word came that far away in the east, Mongol had died on campaign against the Song, and Hulagu, like Batu in Europe before him, withdrew the greater part of his army eastward to attend to the succession, and to guard his own interests in the coming struggle for power, leaving only a smaller force behind to hold his conquests. That smaller force, advancing into the lands near the coast, met at last an enemy it could not overcome, the Mamluks of Egypt. The Mamluks, themselves a warrior people of steppe origin, who fought in a manner the Mongols understood, marched out to meet them, and in a great battle, in the year 1260, the Mamluks defeated the Mongol army and drove it back. It was one of the first times a major Mongol force had been beaten in open battle and turned away, and it set a limit, at last, upon the westward march of the empire. The tide that had seemed as if it would swallow the world had finally found a shore it could not pass. And by this time, the empire that Genghis had forged as a single instrument, obedient to one will, was quietly becoming something else. Several great realms, ruled by rival cousins, still Mongol, still bearing the blood of the conqueror, but each increasingly following its own path. The struggle over Mongol's succession would bring that division into the open, and the centre of the Mongol world would shift for good away from the steppe and toward the ancient and seductive civilization of China. The death of Mongol set his brothers against one another. Kublai, who had been waging the war in China, and their youngest brother Arik Bok, who held the old homeland and the traditional capital at Karakoram. Each claimed the title of Great Khan, and each was proclaimed by his own supporters. The two brothers went to war, and for several years. The Mongols, who had conquered so much of the world, turned their weapons upon themselves in a bitter civil struggle. It was a contest between two visions of what the Mongols should be. Arik Bok stood for the old ways, the life of the steppe, the traditions of the grass and the tent and the shamanist sky. Kublai had spent his years among the settled peoples of China, had come to admire their civilization, their cities and their scholars and their arts of government, and meant to rule as an emperor in the Chinese manner as much as a Khan in the Mongol one. In the end, Kublai, with the greater resources of rich northern China behind him, prevailed, and Arik Bok submitted and soon died. But the victory came at a price, for the unity of the empire was broken beyond repair. The distant cousins in Persia and in Russia and in Central Asia went their own ways, acknowledging Kublai as Great Khan in name and in courtesy, but ruling their own vast domains as they pleased. The single empire had become a family of empires, and it would never again move as one. Kublai Khan turned the full weight of his energy to the completion of the greatest task remaining, the conquest of the southern Chinese empire of the Song, the last independent power of the old world of stature enough to defy the Mongols. The Song were rich beyond imagining, masters of a sophisticated and ancient civilization, defended by great rivers and walled cities and huge armies and a powerful navy, for the Song were a seafaring people. And the Mongols, horsemen of the dry grasslands, had no tradition of war upon the water. This was the hardest war the Mongols ever fought, a war of long sieges and river battles that dragged on for years. But the Mongols, adaptable as ever, learned what they lacked. They built fleets and recruited sailors from among the conquered Chinese, They mastered the siege of the mightiest fortress cities, and slowly, grindingly, they wore the Song Empire down, one great walled city on a river, held out against them for years, until at last it fell to a bombardment from mighty catapults. And after that, the Song resistance began to collapse. The war moved south, city by city, until the last remnant of the Song court, a child emperor and his loyal officials, was cornered against the southern sea by the Mongol fleet. In a final desperate battle upon the water, the Song were destroyed, and it is told that a loyal minister, seeing that all was lost, took the boy emperor in his arms and leapt with him from the deck of a ship into the sea, so that the child would not fall into the hands of the conquerors. With that, the long war was over, and for the first time in centuries, all of China, north and south, was united under a single ruler, and that ruler was a Mongol. Kublai Khan now sat upon the throne of the oldest and one of the richest civilizations on earth, master of China and great Khan of the Mongols, ruler in name over an empire that stretched to the edges of the world. He founded a new dynasty to rule China in the Chinese fashion, giving it a Chinese name, the Yuan, so that his line would take its place in the long succession of Chinese emperors. And he built himself a magnificent new capital in the north, on the site of what is today the city of Beijing, a great city of palaces and walls and gardens that dazzled all who saw it. Kublai understood, as his grandfather had understood in his own way, that an empire cannot be governed forever from the saddle, that to hold China he must become, in part, a Chinese emperor, ruling through the ancient machinery of Chinese government, employing scholars and officials, sponsoring the arts, honouring the traditions of the land. Yet he never forgot that he was a Mongol, and he kept his people apart, at the top of society, a ruling caste of horsemen set above the vast population of their subjects, and he kept alive the old ways in his summer capital, out on the edge of the grasslands, where he could hunt and feast and breathe the air of the steppe his ancestors had come from. He was a man of two worlds, the grandson of a nomad conqueror seated upon the dragon throne of China, and under him the Mongol Empire reached the very summit of its wealth and its glory, and it was to the court of this most magnificent of Khan that there came, out of the distant west, a young man from the trading city of Venice, whose account of the wonders he saw would fire the imagination of Europe for centuries to come. The young man from Venice was named Marco Polo, and he had come the whole enormous length of the Silk Road, across deserts and mountains, and through the strange cities of Central Asia, in the company of his father and his uncle, merchants, who had made the journey once before. It was the Mongol peace that made such a journey possible at all, the guarded roads and the relay stations and the single law that stretched from one end of Asia to the other. When at last the Polos reached the court of Kublai Khan, the great ruler took a liking to the observant and clever young Marco, and kept him in his service for many years, sending him on missions to the far corners of the empire, and listening with pleasure to his accounts of all he had seen. Marco Polo travelled through the length and breadth of Kublai's domains, and when at last he returned to Venice after more than 20 years abroad, he told, or dictated from a prison cell where he was later held, a book of his travels that astonished and half convinced his countrymen, for the wonders he described seemed too great to be believed. He wrote of the summer capital of the Khan, a place of such fabled splendour that its name, which we render as Xanadu, has become a word for any far-off place of dreamlike luxury, with its marble palace and its parks full of game, and its portable palace of gilded and lacquered cane that could be taken down and moved. He wrote of the great new capital in the north, greater and more populous than any city of Europe, with its broad, straight streets and its teeming markets and its palace, so vast and so richly adorned with gold that it beggared description. He wrote of things that Europe had never seen or imagined. He described a black stone that was dug from the mountains and burned hotter and longer than wood, which was cold. He described paper money, mere printed slips that the great Khan commanded be accepted as if they were gold and silver, and marvelled that a ruler could in this way make wealth out of the bark of trees. He described the vast system of relay riders and posts, the wealth of the great river cities, the strange customs, and the countless peoples of the East. Much of what he wrote was true, though later readers, unable to credit such marvels, gave his book a mocking nickname, suggesting it was full of millions of exaggerations. But whether believed or doubted, his account opened a window in the European mind onto the wealth and the wonder of the East. A window that would never quite close, and that would in time help to send other men, generations later, sailing out across unknown oceans in search of the fabled riches of the lands that Marco Polo had described. In a strange and roundabout way, the age of European exploration and the discovery of new worlds owed something keen to a Venetian who had once served a Mongol. The court that Marco Polo described was indeed one of the marvels of the world, a place where the wealth and the artistry of China served the power of the Mongol conqueror, where scholars and astronomers and physicians and craftsmen from every land the empire touched gathered to serve the greatest ruler on earth. Kublai patronized learning and the arts, built roads and canals and granaries, extended the great waterway that carried grain from the rich south to feed the capital in the north, and presided over a flowering of trade and travel and exchange between East and West that was without precedent in all of history. Under him, the two ends of the world were joined as never before, and knowledge and goods and beliefs flowed back and forth along the roads his family had opened. It was the high noon of the Mongol age, the moment of its fullest glory, when a traveller could set out from the shores of the Atlantic and journey, in reasonable safety, all the way to the shores of the Pacific, passing the whole way through lands that owed allegiance, however loosely now, to the house of a single conqueror who had been born a starving outcast in a tent of felt upon the open grass. But even glory has its limits, and Kublai Khan, master of so much, a host of golden daffodils, was about to discover that there were places in the world, and there were forces in the world, that not even the might of the Mongols could overcome. For across a narrow sea to the east lay a proud island kingdom that would defy him, and the story of that defiance would give the world one of its most famous legends. The proud island kingdom was Japan, and Kublai Khan, having conquered China and made himself the master of the Eastern world, turned his ambition toward it as a matter of course. For a ruler who claimed to command all under heaven could not tolerate a nearby land that would not bow. He sent envoys demanding that the Japanese submit and pay him tribute, and when the warriors who ruled Japan refused, and even, in a grave insult by the standards of the age, put some of his envoys to death, Kublai resolved to bring the islands to heel by force. He gathered a great fleet, built with the labour and the skill of his conquered Korean and Chinese subjects, and loaded it with a huge army, and in the year 1274 he launched the first invasion of Japan across the narrow strait that separated the islands from the mainland. The Mongols and their subject soldiers landed and drove the defenders back, for the Japanese warriors, brave as they were and skilled in single combat, were not prepared for the tight massed formations and the strange weapons and the coordinated tactics of the invaders. But the Mongols did not press their advantage inland, whether from caution or losses, or the difficulty of their position on a hostile shore. They withdrew to their ships for the night, and in the darkness a great storm arose and battered the fleet against the coast, wrecking many vessels and drowning many men, so that the survivors were forced to break off the invasion and sail home. Kublai, undeterred, spent years preparing a second and far greater attempt. In the year 1281, he launched an armada so vast that it is counted among the largest seaborne sea invasions in all of history before modern times. Tens of thousands of soldiers carried in thousands of ships, converging upon Japan from two directions. But the Japanese had used the years of respite well. They had built a great defensive wall along the shore of the bay, where they expected the enemy to land, and behind it the assembled warriors of Japan waited. When the Mongol fleet arrived, it found the landing contested at every point, and the invaders, unable to break through the defences, were held for weeks aboard their crowded ships, and in their precarious footholds on the coast, worn down by the fierce resistance and by the raids of small Japanese boats that slipped out at night to burn and to kill. And then, once again, the sea itself rose against the invaders. A tremendous typhoon swept in from the ocean and fell upon the Mongol fleet as it lay crowded in the bay. And the storm was of such terrible violence that it destroyed the armada almost utterly, smashing the ships together and hurling them onto the rocks and swallowing them beneath the waves, drowning a great part of the vast army in a single catastrophe. The remnant that survived limped home in ruin. Twice now, the might of the Mongol Empire had been broken, not by any army, but by the weather of the Eastern Sea, and the Japanese, marvelling at their deliverance, gave to the storms that had saved them a name that would echo down the centuries. They called them the kamikaze, the divine wind, believing that the gods themselves had sent the tempests to protect the sacred islands from the foreign conqueror. Kublai contemplated a third invasion, but it never came, and Japan remained forever beyond his grasp. Japan was not the only frustration of Kublai's later years, nor the only place where the limits of Mongol power were revealed. He sent armies south into the hot and difficult lands of Southeast Asia, into the jungles and river deltas of what is now Vietnam and beyond. And though they won victories and forced rulers to acknowledge his overlordship, they suffered terribly in the alien climate, in the heat and the disease and the trackless country so unlike the open steppe. And they could not truly conquer and hold those distant tropical lands. A great seaborne expedition sent even further, against a kingdom on the island of Java, in the warm seas of the far south, ended in humiliation and withdrawal, after the Mongols were cleverly outmaneuvered by the very ruler they had come to punish. Everywhere, the empire had reached the natural boundaries of its strength, the deep seas and the dense jungles and the far mountains where horsemen could not easily go, and where the discipline of the steppe availed nothing against a hostile nature. The empire had grown as large as it ever would, and larger than any empire before or since, and now, having touched its farthest limits in every direction, it began, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, to turn from growing toward fading. The conquering was finished. What remained was the long, quiet, human business of holding on, and then, in time, of letting go. By the time of Kublai's death, the single empire of Genghis Khan had become in truth 4 great realms, 4 khanates, each ruled by a different branch of the conqueror's descendants, each drifting ever further from the others. In the far east lay the greatest of them, the Yuan dynasty of Kublai and his heirs, ruling China and the Mongolian homeland and claiming a shadowy overlordship over all the rest. In the west, across Persia and Mesopotamia, ruled the descendants of Hulagu, the Ilkhanate, lords of the ancient lands of the Middle East. In Central Asia lay the realm of the descendants of Chagatai, one of Genghis's sons, a wild and unsettled country that clung longest to the old nomadic ways. And in the north and west, across the vast plains of Russia and the steppes beyond, ruled the descendants of Batu, the Khanate that came to be called the Golden Horde, whose grip upon the Russian principalities would endure for generations. These four realms were still bound by the blood of a common ancestor and by the memory of a common origin. But they had different faiths and different interests and different destinies, and increasingly they warred among themselves, cousin against cousin, so that the Mongol peace that had knit the world together began to fray. One by one, the great Khanates were changed and softened and absorbed by the older, deeper civilizations they had conquered. The Mongols were always a small ruling minority, set over vast populations of subjects, and over the generations, the subjects reshaped the rulers more than the rulers reshaped the subjects. In Persia and in the lands of the Golden Horde, the Mongols in time embraced the faith of Islam, adopting the religion of the peoples they ruled and mingling with them until the distinction between conqueror and conquered blurred and faded. In China, the Yuan dynasty, for all its early vigour, could not escape the ancient rhythm of Chinese history, in which dynasties rise strong and decline weak. The later Yuan emperors were lesser men than Kublai. The government grew corrupt, and the currency of paper money that Marco Polo had marvelled at collapsed in ruinous inflation, and floods and famines struck the land, which the people took as signs that heaven had withdrawn its favour from their foreign rulers. Rebellions broke out across China, and at last a great uprising, led by a man of humble peasant origin, drove the Mongols out and back onto the steppe from which they had come, and a new native Chinese dynasty, the Ming, took the throne. Less than a century after Kublai had united all of China under Mongol rule, the descendants of the conquerors were riding back north across the frontier, returning to the grasslands of their ancestors, the great adventure in China over. So it went in one land after another. The Ilkhanate in Persia broke apart into quarrelling fragments. The Chagatai realm splintered. The Golden Horde endured longest of all, holding its dominion over Russia for 2 centuries and more. But it too weakened and divided in the end, and the Russian princes, who had for so long paid it tribute and bowed to its khans, at last grew strong enough to throw off the yoke, and the memory of that long subjection became a wound and a spur in the Russian soul for centuries afterward. Everywhere the tide that had risen so swiftly and so violently receded again, and the peoples the Mongols had conquered emerged, changed but enduring, into a world the Mongols had reshaped and then departed. The empire that had been the largest the world had ever seen dissolved back, over a few generations, into the older patterns of history, and the horsemen returned to their grass. And yet the mark they left upon the world could never be erased. They had, for a brief and violent and extraordinary moment, joined the two halves of a continent that had known each other only as rumour, and along the roads they opened had flowed not only silk and silver, but ideas and technologies and diseases and dreams, knowledge of gunpowder and printing, and the compass making its way westward, changing Europe forever, and the terrible pestilence we remember as the Black Death travelling, some believe, along those same trade routes, to devastate half the known world. They had redrawn the map of Asia, destroyed old powers, and raised new ones, and left behind them peoples and rulers who traced their descent from Genghis and boasted of it for centuries. So many were the children of the conqueror and of his sons that even today, it is said, a remarkable number of the men of Central Asia carry in their very blood the inheritance of that single family born out of the grass. The Mongols had passed like a great storm across the face of the world, and when the storm had blown itself out, the world was not the same, and never would be again. There is one part of the story that the old chronicles, written mostly by frightened men in distant lands, too often passed over, and it deserves its place before we come to the end, for it reveals something unexpected about a people we remember only for their ferocity among the Mongols. The women held a power and a place that would have astonished the settled civilizations to the south and west, where the wives of kings were kept behind walls and counted for little in the affairs of state. On the steppe it had always been otherwise. When the men rode away to war, for months and years at a time, it was the women who managed the herds and the camps and the whole business of survival, who struck the tents and drove the wagons and held the family together. And from this hard necessity there grew a respect and an authority that the women of the Mongols carried even into the palaces of empire. The mother of Genghis Khan, Holan, who had kept her abandoned children alive by digging roots along the riverbanks, was honoured all his life as a woman of iron will, and his wife Borte, whom he had crossed the steppe to claim and had gone to war to rescue, remained his most trusted counsellor to the end, the mother of the sons who would inherit the world. And when the great Khans died, again and again it was their widows who held the empire together in the dangerous years between one ruler and the next. After the death of Ogedei, his widow governed the whole vast realm as regent for years, holding the reins of an empire that spanned a continent. But the most remarkable of them all was a woman named Sorgatani Beki, the widowed daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan, a princess of great wisdom who refused offers of remarriage in order to devote herself entirely to the raising and the advancement of her 4 sons. She was praised by observers from many nations as one of the ablest and most intelligent rulers of the age, a woman who managed vast domains, who tolerated and supported many faiths, who understood that to govern the settled peoples one must respect their ways, and who trained her sons so well in the arts of rule that no fewer than 4 of them became Khans, and 2 of them, Mongol and Kublai, became great Khans and masters of the Mongol world. It was said of her that had she been a man, she would have been reckoned among the greatest rulers who ever lived, and even in an age that could not quite bring itself to give a woman her full due, her genius shone through. Behind the thunder of the horsemen and the burning of the cities, there stood these formidable women, holding the fabric of the empire together, choosing and shaping the men who would rule it, and reminding us that the world of the Mongols was stranger and richer, and more human than the simple picture of savage conquest that has come down to us. How, then, are we to remember them, these horsemen, who rose out of nothing to conquer nearly everything, and then faded back into the grass from which they had come? For 8 centuries the world has argued over the answer, and the arguing tells us as much about ourselves as about the Mongols, a host of golden daffodils, to the peoples who stood in their path, to the cities of Persia and the scholars of Baghdad, and the princes of Russia, and the chroniclers of frightened Europe. They were a scourge and a horror almost beyond description, a punishment sent by God, a demonic host that emptied the world of its people and its treasures, and left only ash and bone behind. The numbers of the dead in the great sieges, whether we accept of them fully or halve them or quarter them, still describe a slaughter on a scale that staggers the mind and the libraries burned, and the cities that never rose again, represent a loss to human civilization that can never be measured or restored. There is no gentle way to tell that part of the story, and it would be a lie to try. And yet the same people who wrought this destruction also created something that has fascinated and even inspired the world ever since, out of the chaos of the warring steppe. Genghis Khan built order where there had never been order. He gave his people a written script, adapting one from a conquered nation, so that a people who had known only spoken memory could at last keep records and laws and letters. He established a code of law that fell upon rich and poor alike, and he insisted, in an age of casual cruelty, upon the punishment of theft and betrayal, and the protection of the traveller and the merchant and the envoy. He judged men by their loyalty and their ability rather than by the accident of their birth, raising the humble to command and honouring faithfulness above blood. And in this he was, in his own harsh way, ahead of his age. He practiced a tolerance of different faiths that the great civilizations of his day, forever slaughtering one another over doctrine, could not begin to match. And he and his heirs opened the roads of the world and made them safe, so that for a golden century a merchant or a monk or a scholar could travel from the shores of one ocean to the shores of another, and knowledge and goods and understanding could flow between peoples who had never before been able to reach one another. The modern world, with its trade across oceans and its meeting of distant cultures, owes something in a strange and roundabout way to the peace that the horseman imposed upon the roads. So the man remains a paradox, and perhaps that is the truest thing that can be said of him. In his homeland he is honoured above all others, his face upon the money, and his name upon the airport and the great square, remembered not as a destroyer but as the father of a nation, the man who took a scattered and despised people and made them, for a moment, the masters of the earth. In much of the rest of the world his name is still a byword for terror. Both memories are true. He was one of the most destructive men who ever lived, and he was also one of the greatest builders and organisers and lawgivers. And these were not two different men but one, the starving boy, who had learned in the cold and the hunger of his childhood that loyalty was everything, and that mercy shown to an enemy was often only weakness that would return to destroy you. The world had made him hard, and he had returned that hardness to the world 1,000-fold, and out of it he had wrought an empire. The grave that hides him keeps its secret still, somewhere out on the vast grasslands he came from, beneath a sky as wide and empty as it was. On the day he was born, the greatest conqueror in the history of mankind lies in an unmarked spot that no living person knows, his bones, long since become part of the earth and the grass, indistinguishable now from the poorest herdsman who ever wandered those plains. There is something fitting in that anonymity, something that closes the circle of the story. He began as one hungry child among thousands, nameless and unregarded, born into poverty on the edge of the known world. He made himself, for a time, the most powerful man on earth, the ruler whose word could send armies across continents and empty cities of their people. And in the end, the grass took him back and hid him, and returned him to the wind that never stops, so that he vanished into the land as completely as he had once emerged from it, leaving behind him only the memory, and the changed and connected world, and the endless, ancient, silver-green sea of grass rolling on toward a horizon with no edge, exactly as it had rolled before he was born, and exactly as it rolls tonight. And here, our long ride across the grass comes gently to its end. The great Khan sleeps in his hidden grave, and the empire he raised has faded back into the earth and the wind, and the cities he burned have either risen again or passed forever out of memory. The thunder of the horsemen has died away into silence, and only the grass remains, moving softly in the dark, as it has always moved, patient and endless and calm. Let the names grow quiet now. Let the years drift away like dust upon the steppe. There is nothing left to do tonight but rest, and let the wide grasslands carry you down into sleep, out under a sky full of stars, in a world grown peaceful and still. Rest now. Let it all go. Sleep well and good night.